I'm Ian Mean, I'm Content Director for Local World for Bristol, Gloucestershire, Somerset and Dorset. The subject of tonight's special lecture, sponsored by the Bristol Post, is reflecting on the continuing economic decline of the West. And I'm going to be interviewing very shortly the Executive Chairman of PA Consulting Group, Jon Moynihan. Okay, Jon Moynihan, you're an OBE, you're chairman of an internationally known company, PA Consulting. You're about to retire, I gather, or try
Correct.
to retire.
Yes.
Tell me something about your career, very briefly.
Well, I left England in 1976, mostly on account of what was happening in England and the 3-day week and other things which I thought were pretty calamitous. And I went off to America for 20 years, first to go to MIT to study finance, and afterwards to go into the consulting profession. And I ended up going into quite a few consulting firms and ended up being headhunted back from the US to run PA Consulting Group, first as chief executive and later on as chairman. And I've been there for 21 years, which is probably far too long. And now I'm retiring at age 65.
You're not going to give up work?
No. I also am chairman of a venture capital company, and I also have various other charitable and other interests.
Now, PA Consulting is an interesting company because it's owned by
us, the employees, that's right.
Just tell us something about the philosophy of PA Consulting.
Well, we believe in technology, and technology suffuses everything that we do. And we find innovative ways to bring technology to our clients. And when a client has to use a new technology that they don't know much about, they often like to call us in and help them start off. And then we get them up to speed, and then they can go off by themselves. And when I say technology, I'm not just talking about computers and IT. I'm talking about science, materials, medicine, food technology, all sorts of different technologies. We try to get these new technologies into companies so that they can innovate, stay ahead of the curve, be world-beating, and we're quite successful at doing that.
So that has been your basic philosophy?
That's the basic philosophy, and as you said, we're employee-owned. You can only own shares if you are an employee, and once you leave, like I'm going to be, you have to sell your shares back to the firm, and we keep the shares quite low so that they make a good return. They've gone up about 100-fold in the 21 years I've been here, so anybody who invested 10,000 quid in PA 21 years ago and kept the shares would now have £1 million.
Did you do that?
I did. In fact, I required all the senior people to invest 100,000 when we first started. So about 40 people all invested 100,000 quid because we were essentially bankrupt and needed the money. And obviously I put in a little bit more than that. So I'm going to take out a little bit more than that.
Right. Now, tonight's lecture, reflecting on the continuing economic decline of the West. What can we really do, Jon, to stop that?
Well, first of all, being here in Bristol, I should say, the decline of the West wasn't meant to be a slur on the west of England.
Western world.
The Western world, which in my book includes Japan. So it isn't. The West is a word or a phrase rather than a particular geographical spot. But what I believe is we have to get real. We have to stop fooling ourselves that we have an easy birth in life here in the West, which we have had for years. The great thing about the rest of the world is that they pursued socialism or even outright communism for decades, which made us fat and happy because we didn't have any competition. Once all those countries outside what we call the West abandoned that, then suddenly we're competing with people whose wages are literally 1/20th of what ours are.
Is that at the heart of our problems?
The wages are right at the heart, but also the fact that they work harder, that they don't have so many restraints, that they don't have so many employment laws of, anti-harassment, anti-stress, pro-health and safety and so forth, all of which, people make jokes about them and people think, oh, they're just moaning about political correctness, but these are actually major shackles on companies to go forward and actually get things done, rather than sort of focusing on the hygiene factors of what it takes to run a company.
So how do we sort that out? Because some of that sounds quite simple.
You would have to get rid of a whole bunch of legislation. You'd have to make it a whole bunch easier for people to employ and fire people in order to get companies that really can compete in the world today. And it's really important to understand that every time we put a new law on, when we put a carbon tax on factories, then all that happens is that factory closes down, it moves to China, where they don't have a carbon tax and where actually they pollute far worse. The goods are still made, the pollution is now twice as much in the world, and we've lost a whole bunch of jobs in this country. It's really important to understand the implications of all these laws.
So if you, John, if you were Prime Minister, you would have that in your pocket. You could deliver that, couldn't you?
I think you definitely could if you were lucky enough to have a majority that would allow you to implement a bunch of things. You'd have to do them very quickly in your first term, because otherwise you wouldn't stand a rat's chance of getting re-elected 5 years later, because so much of this country has gotten used to the government providing. And if the government has to stop providing, and if the government has to be smaller, it's now around 50% of the economy. And we can't afford that in this country.
What percentage should it be?
There are some libertarians who claim that the appropriate size of government is 13%. There are some extreme libertarians who say you shouldn't even provide schools and it should be even less than 13%. I think that's silly, because I think education is the answer, not the problem, and sorting out education in this country is absolutely crucial. But if essential government is only around 15% of the economy, that's what you need to spend to stop mugging in the street and so forth. Maybe 30% is about the right thing if you are going to provide a safety net and health and things like that. But once you get above 30%, it's really quite difficult to run an economy that can be competitive in the world today. And you can see that. There have been tons of studies that show when governments start spending more of the GDP than that, then economic growth collapses, jobs collapse, and so forth.
How do we compare with the States in those figures?
We are way above the States. The worst countries are something like France, where the state is approaching 60%. We only have a tax take of about 40%, but we spend about 50%, which is why we're spending about 100.
So we're never going to win, are we? Yeah.
Well, we're currently spending about 120 billion a year more than we get in taxes, which means we have to borrow that money, which means our national debt is going up and up and up. And the big thing, some of it is not so much about spending less, it's about spending in the right places. I see somewhere like Bristol as key to the future of this country. It's got some great universities, it's got some terrific businesses, it's got a really hard-working ethic. And if you took that and you started putting some real money behind it, you started putting money into the science departments of Bristol University and other universities, if you started really helping kids study science, study maths, study the so-called STEM, science, technology, engineering, medicine subjects, and really putting money behind them, and then funding the IP, the intellectual property that comes out of those academic departments, and then really doing stuff to help that intellectual property turn into innovation and new companies, then someone like Bristol could be part of the answer. There are half a dozen major cities in the UK that could be terrific, Bristol, Newcastle, Birmingham, Manchester, that could be far more important in getting this country right again. But it would mean the government taking money from where it's spending money now and putting it into that sort of effort.
Why doesn't someone have that idea about Bristol, for instance?
I think the three main political parties all have the same basic view, which is that the government should provide. And some of them may have views that, we shouldn't really be doing this. Nonetheless, they think if they stop spending that money, they will be kicked out of office. Well, the news is they're actually going to be kicked out of office anyway, so it would have been great to sort of try and sort things out. But it isn't clear. One of the things I'm going to be talking about this evening is the Keynesian view of the world, which says that in order to get out of economic problems, the government should spend more. And that's a view that has essentially been held by all ruling governments since the 1950s and became really blocked in the 1970s until now, with the one exception of the regime of Margaret Thatcher, which was a blip, because she believed in Hayek's economics, which are exactly the opposite of Keynesian. Hayek says that the government spending lots of money on things can actually be totally disastrous. And I think he's been proved pretty right. But nonetheless, Keynesianism has been locked into the mindset of all the main political parties. And they
looking at the Labour Party.
Yes.
I mean, do you see the Labour Party being able to be elected in the next election after what went on before?
Well, one of the things I talk about is how computers are taking over, and all sorts of jobs within the next 40 years are going to go by the wayside. An obvious one, for example, is taxi drivers. I had a very nice taxi driver driving me here. He didn't know where City Hall was.
But he's a Bristol taxi driver.
Yes, and therefore, we drove around a very interesting scenic tour of Bristol for a while. Within 10 to 15 years, there will be no taxi drivers. It'll be autonomous cars, all of which, incidentally, will know where City Hall is. But nonetheless, there won't be the need of a driver. That's just one example of the jobs that are gone. And that's one of the new problems that the West is going to face when so many jobs go. One of the jobs that's going to go, back to your question, is that of political pundit. Because it turns out that computers are much better at predicting elections than political pundits. There's a computer-derived algorithm over in the States that was able to predict Barack Obama's majority 6 months before the election to the seat, to the state. So every seat of the Electoral College was predicted correctly for every state by this computer 6 months ahead of time. There's a couple of websites here in the UK that are doing the same. It means all political pundits who are all saying, oh no, Mitt Romney has a chance, just a few weeks before the election.
What about editors?
Political editors may be a little bit challenged. But the point is that although it's too far out, there may be a tightening of this race. The algorithmic, computer-based predictions are all for Labour to have a majority of 40, 50, 60 seats, overall majority. They won't have to go into a coalition. They're saying, by the way, Lib Dems are going to have 20 seats down from 50-something.
So what's the Moynihan verdict at the moment? Where are we going to be politically at the next election?
Well, there are some fairly crazy economic proposals being put forward by some political parties who may end up with a majority in 2015. Very often such radical proposals don't actually get implemented once the party gets into power.
Like the utilities and electricity.
That would be an example of something that any economist of any stripe would tell you is a very unwise thing to be proposing. I mean, we have had socialism over the world and in something like 70 countries, and it has failed in every single one. So it would be remarkable if it succeeded here after that experience. But they may not implement that. That's to be hoped. But I don't think that the indication is that any party is going to take the sort of radical steps that I believe you have to take.
Which are what? What would you do? You're in the driving seat. You
Pour
won the next
a huge amount of resources into education, particularly at the university level, particularly into science, but also in schools, in mathematics. And there are some good things happening there. For example, in London, they're about to have a free school, one of these new Michael Gove free schools, that attracts the very best mathematicians in London. These are the really bright, nerdy kids who are going to be really bored in normal school because they are absolutely brilliant. And of course, by the way, one of the great bits of news is that kids' IQs are about 20 points higher on average than when you or I were youngsters. And they're much brighter than us. And so you've got all these really bright kids. They'll be taking a few hundred of these really bright kids and just teaching them mathematics at sixth form. That sort of thing can transform the nation if you really get it right. So that's good news. And so there's lots of good news. But so education, number one. Second, you have got to find a way to spend less money on welfare. You've got to find ways to actually spend less money on health, because health is going to take a huge amount of money out of the economy.
Shouldn't we be paying more towards our health, like in America?
I think that a price signal where you pay a certain minimal amount, like they do in France, like they do in Germany, can be very important in getting people not to waste resources. But the other issue is that, and I speak as somebody who's getting old, 25% approximately of healthcare, they say, is spent in the last year of life, officiously striving to keep people alive through those last few anguished weeks. And it's awful for the relatives. It's terrible for the relatives. And I saw you're very big on organ donation, which I applaud.
The organ donation committee.
I applaud tremendously. And by the way, just over the border in Wales, they've made it that you're assumed to have consented to give your organs. But nowadays, they force the grieving relatives, a couple of hours after the person has died, to say, oh, would you like us to harvest a kidney from your dead son, or whatever. And I've done a lot of work on this. I've conducted private opinion polls on it. One thing people hate to do is donate their eyes.
That's true.
It's very interesting. But
people have a real thing about that.
The thing is, you're dead. You're dead.
People think taking an eye or the cornea is almost... you're doing something to the body.
Exactly, but you're not.
No.
You're dead. I'm
right.
dead. And it's what I think is, if you could banish magical thinking from England, thinking magically, that somehow it matters if they take your eye out. And by the way, somebody who's blind will be able to see because you've done that. Kidneys, somebody who's dying will be, and will die unless that comes out, will live. So is this end to magical thinking, but an end to spending 25% of healthcare in the last year of life versus, let's say, spending it on the first 17 years of life when we're trying to educate kids. 40% of children leave school without a C pass in maths and English.
Wasn't that an amazing survey that's in all the papers today, where we're
exactly another one today.
22nd Northern Ireland beat us.
That's right. That's right.
Isn't that appalling? I mean, I was shocked. Were you shocked by that?
Yes. Well, no, I wasn't shocked because I talk about it all the time. Right. But
everyone thought that's shocking. It's new. You are not shocked.
No, because I've been banging on about education for several years. It's absolutely central to getting this country right. And I believe that we took an appalling wrong turn in education when Tony Crosland abolished the grammar schools, when we consistently refused to go the German route of having technical colleges and academic colleges, because so many people would benefit from a technical education rather than an academic one. And so many kids are bored by something that's over academic, whereas they could, as they do in Germany, learn a trade or whatever.
Some people say this is the age of apprentice. Our newspapers campaign for apprentice. You think that's good, apprentices?
The idea is wonderful, but its implementation is very small. And yet again, the government is putting the burden onto the company and saying, here, we've got this great idea about apprenticeships. By the way, you have to do it. It's going to cost you. The whole burden's on you. But why? Because we're spending money on, free school meals for all children, many of whom can perfectly afford it themselves. Because it's just silly. It's magical thinking.
Now, we're talking... Right, what I want to... This can get quite depressing, can't it, John? Because what do we do in this country that's good? What can we do that actually beats up the East here in the West?
There is a counterbalance to all the doom and gloom. And the counterbalance is the technology revolution, basically. It's the technology revolution combined with the fact that a lot of kids nowadays want to be entrepreneurs. A huge number of people want to be entrepreneurs, which was never the case in the 70s or even the 80s or the 90s.
Why?
I think they understand now. They've seen the inspirational stories of Apple and Google and all these other things. And now you've got Silicon Fen up in Cambridge. You've got Tech City in London. And bit by bit, I believe places like Bristol could pull their act together in terms of what a city needs, by the way, is what Cambridge has, is what London has, what other places have, is a group of rich guys. The great thing about capitalism is it's rich guys with a bit of capital who put that capital behind a new idea and back an entrepreneur who probably...
We've got people like that, haven't we? We've
Yes.
seen good people
Yes,
in
indeed.
Cambridge, people like Alan Sugar, who, you know...
That's right. But you need a bunch of them locally, and you need those people who are integrated into the university and understand the ideas that are coming out of the academy, the scientific ideas, the innovation that could be put into practice. The new EIS scheme, by the way, is brilliant. There's a huge amount of people.
What does that stand for?
I haven't a clue.
Right.
But it's something scheme, and it's basically that you get a lot of tax breaks for backing a new entrepreneur
Right.
in a new
Right.
piece of development. And the tax breaks are sufficient. There's also an SEIS, which is a special EIS, and I don't know what that stands for. But you get even more tax breaks because it's for little small things and real startups. But by doing that, there are all these little companies growing up and mushrooming, and there's so many technologies. You could probably rattle off 100 technologies.
So do you see, John, the sort of future of this country being in blunt terms the sort of SME area? Is it those smaller, medium-sized firms that are going to make us?
It's only the small firms that create jobs. Everybody thinks that big companies create jobs, but they only get larger by buying other companies usually. And usually what they're about is rationalizing and cutting costs in order to become more and more profitable. They've shown over and over again that it's the small startups that create jobs. Obviously small startups like Google or Apple or whatever eventually grow into big companies, but in the meantime it's they that create jobs. And so yes, they are the answer. And it's funding them, and for us in the UK, where we are creative, if we let people go and let them flourish by themselves and get the shackles of the state off of them, they do create jobs. There's neuroscience, there's bioscience, there's anti-carbon science, there's so many different technologies that there are the opportunity to create great businesses out of.
So you think we can still create great businesses here to compete with the East? You're not down on Britain.
No, I think that if we remove the shackles from business, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do, and governments always say they're going to do it and they don't, because they're not prepared to take the extreme steps.
You mean they're hiring and firing and the sort of legislation that surrounds...
And what they can be sued for, what employees can sue them for, you've got to remove all of that. It's actually, unfortunately, it's got to be easy to fire somebody, otherwise you're not going to hire them in the first place. It's very straightforward. And companies, particularly they're very small companies, are absolutely terrified of hiring lots of people if then they can't get rid of them quick enough to avoid, because every small company goes through the valley of death for a few years where it's not working out and they've got to save every penny. You've got to be really, really good to run a company like that, and you've also got to have all the luck in the world. So you're not going to be able to manage it half the time if you've got a whole bunch of government restraints behind you.
One last question. Message for the University of the West of England here. They are very innovative. What's your advice to them?
Focus on entrepreneurship. Try and bring entrepreneurs in. get teachers who really understand what it's like to do a startup, get close to the science departments of other universities, whether it's down in Exeter or anywhere near, and start trying to create innovation hubs. Have technology competitions, have entrepreneurship competitions, host local businessmen to come in, have innovation platforms where once a month any entrepreneur can come in and present their ideas to interested business people. One of the things I think would be absolutely great would be to host a local stock exchange, where it's not like the London Stock Exchange. It's a real stock exchange where you can trade off a platform, lots of electronic platforms, but where the chief executive has to come once a month and talk to the shareholders face to face and say what they're doing and how they're spending the money. Because shareholders are often quite good at telling companies what to do. But so there's so many things that a great university like UWE can do to foster this kind of entrepreneurial, innovative spirit.
Good. Jon Moynihan, thank you very much.
Thank you.